A Social History of Anthropology in the United States by Thomas C. Patterson. Anthropology in the Liberal Age, 1879 to 1929. The dominant image of the 19th century America was that it had been forged by westward expansion through the Alleghenies, across the Mississippi River, over the high plains and Rocky Mountains to the Pacific. The advance of white settlement was said to have tamed the savagery of this wilderness and its inhabitants, as farmers and then merchants moved into almost empty lands. In the process, the wilderness of Ohio and Mississippi valleys, which was unfit for civilized peoples, was transformed into the garden of the world. However, this agrarian utopia was destroyed, or rather aborted, as Henry Nash Smith perceptively noted, by the land speculator and the railroad monopolist. These were, in turn, but expressions of larger forces at work in American society after the Civil War: the machine, the devices of corporate finance, and the power of big business over Congress. By the 1870s, more than a dozen cities, from Pittsburgh to Chicago to Kansas Cities, were industrial centers that belonged to the new age of steam and steel rather than to the agrarian past. The wilderness beyond the agricultural frontier, which had receded steadily earlier in the century, was closed. Westward expansion, which ultimately caused the disappearance of free land, also eliminated the safety valve that relieved poverty in the East and that promoted equality and democracy as members of the urban poor and middling classes became Midwestern farmers. As the frontier closed, the farmers were transformed into agrarian capitalists whose fate hinged on distant markets, shipping costs, and fluctuations in commodity prices. However, after the Indian Wars of the 1880s, just when it seemed that civilization had finally triumphed over savagery in this story, calls for further imperial expansion reappeared as big business sought access to and control over foreign markets, first in the Caribbean and Latin America, and then in the Pacific and Far East. In the 1890s, America annexed Western Samoa, acquired Hawaii, and conquered Puerto Rico, the Philippines, and Cuba. This brought millions of dark-skinned people into America's political orbit. At the same time, the industrialization of American homeland and the exclusion of African Americans from its workplaces attracted tens of millions of immigrants from Southern and Eastern Europe, Italians, Slavs, Greeks, and Jews, who sought jobs in racially and ethnically stratified labor markets of the industrial cities in the Northeast and the Great Lakes states. The classism, racism, sexism, and xenophobia associated with these events were recorded in national mass media, whose development after the Civil War was buttressed by cheaper printing costs, by the half-literacy that large segments of the population had gained, and free public schools, and by the growth of the national market for books and magazines that facilitated by the expansion of the railroads. These were subsequently expressed in the various Jim Crow laws of the 1890s and the anti-immigration legislation and Palmer raids of the 1920s, which targeted blacks and working-class immigrants and political radicals. The late 19th and early 20th centuries were also marked by the creation and the expansion of the federal bureaucracy, by an increase of number of colleges, by new curricula, and the appearance of new professors. Anthropology as a profession developed in this context. By the 1879 and 1900, most of the individuals who earned their livelihood from anthropology were employed by one of the three government agencies with intertwined histories: the Smithsonian Institution, the National Museum, and the Bureau of Ethnology, which was renamed the Bureau of American Ethnology in 1894. However, by 1910, the profession's center of gravity had shifted away from the federal government towards museums and universities. The beginnings of professional anthropology. Collectors and explorers ensured that a steady stream of ethnographic and archaeological specimens from Western territories, as well as vocabulary lists from extant Indian peoples in the region, flowed eastward in the 1850s and the 1860s. In 1868, the secretary of the Smithsonian Institution noted that 20% of new materials assessed each year were anthropological, and that donors often spent their winters residing in the institution's living quarters as they organized their collections. The volume increased in the 1870s as survey parties from 4 exploring expeditions in the West brought back photographs and reports of ancient ruins and cultures, as well as information about contemporary native peoples. Nevertheless, the acquisition of anthropological information was still for the most part incidental to the primary goals of these expeditions, which were to explore and map the lands beyond the 100th meridian and to note their natural resources. 2 events in the 1870s altered the organization of these surveys. One was a congressional investigation in 1874, instigated by the War Department, that queried the cost and duplication effort of these surveys. 4 years later, the House Appropriations Committee refused to provide further funding until surveys were consolidated and their budgets were trimmed. The Army's influence over congressional appropriations waned after General Ulysses S. Grant left the presidency, and James Garfield, Grant's successor, recommended that the exploration of the West, as well as its exploitation and settlement, be placed under the control of the Secretary of the Interior rather than the War Department. The other pivotal event occurred earlier, in 1873, when the Commissioner of Indian Affairs and the Secretary of the Interior asked Major John Wesley Powell, the leader of the Colorado River Survey, to report on the conditions of the Indians in Utah and Nevada and the circumstances that brought about their plight. Powell had crisscrossed the region many times without military escort since his first expedition in 1867. He had met Indians, recorded their languages, and made collections of their arts and crafts. He spoke to many in their own language, and his honesty and integrity earned him their respect. After meeting with the Tribal Council in 1873, Powell returned to Washington to report on the illegal activities of various Indian agents and to make recommendations to Congress. The Army should discontinue its military campaigns against the Indians, he argued, and the various tribes and wandering bands should be placed on reservations with sufficient arable soil, water, game, and other resources. In his view, the reservations should be schools where the Indians could farm and learn about private property, practical crafts, and the ways of the white man. In a word, they should be the centers of acculturation where the Indians could become Americanized and self-reliant. By 1877, the acquisition of ethnological and linguistic information had become a major priority for Powell. He had already collected more than 200 vocabulary lists, and after consulting with Yale's eminent philologist William D. Whitney, who had participated briefly with his brother in one of the Western surveys, he published a guide describing how Indian vocabulary should be collected. Powell was also lobbying various congressmen and close friends such as U.S. Grant and James Garfield about the value of anthropological research in the West. In addition, he wrote popular accounts for the mass media, which publicized various aspects of Indian life in the West. In a report to the Secretary of Interior, Powell provided a detailed explanation of the Indian problem and reinstated the urgent need for immediate inquiry. The work is of great magnitude. More than 400 languages belonging to about 60 different stocks have been found within the territory of the United States. Little value can be accomplished in making investigations in other branches in the field without thorough knowledge of the languages. Their sociology, mythology, arts, and etc. are not properly known until the people themselves are understood with their own conceptions, opinions, and motives. The field of research is speedily narrowing because of the rapid change in the Indian population now in progress. All habits, customs, and opinions are fading away. Even languages are disappearing. And in a couple years, it will be impossible to study our North American Indians in their primitive condition except from recorded history. The rapid spread of civilization since 1849 has placed the white man and the Indian in direct conflict throughout the whole area, and the Indian problem is thus thrust upon us and must be solved wisely or unwisely. Many of the difficulties are inherent, but an equal number of unnecessary and caused by the lack of our knowledge relating to the Indians themselves. Savagery is not an inchoate civilization. It is a distinct status of society with its own institutions, customs, philosophy, and religion. Among all North American Indians, when in primitive condition, personal property is almost unknown. Ornaments and clothing are only recognized as the property of the individuals, and these to only a limited extent. The right to soil as landed property, the rights to the products of the chase, etc., was inherent in a group of relatives. We usually attempted to treat with the tribes through their chiefs, as if they wielded absolute power. But an Indian tribe is a pure democracy. Their chieftaincy is not hereditary, and the chief is but a representative, the speaker of the tribe, and can do no act which his tribe is bound, without being instructed, thus to act in due and established form. The blunders we have made and the wrongs we have inflicted upon the Indians because of our failure to recognize this fact have been cruel and inexcusable, except on the ground of our own ignorance. Following the recommendations of the Secretary of the Smithsonian Institution and the National Academy of Science, Congress created the Bureau of Ethnology in 1879 to complete and publish materials relating to the Indians of North America. It also named Powell as director of the new bureau. The bill was also directed other agencies, notably the Smithsonian Institution, to turn over vocabulary lists and other relevant materials so the work could be completed. To complete the work mandated by Congress, Powell recruited a group of men and women, many of whom, like himself, had been born and raised in the Midwest. They included native Protestants, 2 Irish immigrants, a part Sonora Indian. Their previous work experience was diverse: surveyor, artist, army surgeon, army officer, farmer, newspaper reporter, blacksmith, school teacher, missionary, lawyer, and naturalist, to name only some of the jobs that they had had before coming to the Bureau. The most important long-term goal Powell set for the Bureau's personnel was a compilation of the North American Indian languages and a classification of their genetic relationships. It was intended to update and extend earlier studies of Albert Gallatin and George Gibbs. Specifically, Powell wanted to 1. Standardize linguistic terminology, 2. Determine the first names given particular languages, 3. Classify the languages in families or stocks, and 4. Determine where in the United States various languages were spoken when they were first recorded. At one time or another, the project involved virtually everyone affiliated with the Bureau. It was also supported by General Francis A. Walker, director of the 1880 census and former commissioner of Indian Affairs, who requested that Powell make a census of the Indian tribes and try to classify their linguistic affiliations. Walker believed that the study of Indian languages had practical value. It was essential for administering Indian tribes. In his view, tribes whose members spoke closely related languages could be settled on the same reservations. Powell's own influential classification appeared in 1891. It was based on the study of vocabularies and divided the Indian languages north of Mexico into 58 families. It provided a basis for organizing the chaotic ethnographic material that had been collected earlier in the century, for organizing the tribal synonymy that had been one of Powell's research priorities in the 1880s. These particular long-term lines of inquiry came to fruition with the appearance of the Handbook of American Indians North of Mexico and the Handbook of American Indian Languages. In the 20th century, anthropologists who adopted Powell's view concerning the close relationship between language and culture used his classification as a framework for tackling problems in comparative ethnology and cultural history. Unbeknownst to Powell, a group of antiquarians lobbied Congress in 1881 and persuaded its members to attach a rider to the Bureau's $25,000 appropriation for continuing ethnological research among North American Indians, $5,000 of which shall be expended on continuing archaeological investigation relating to the mound builders and prehistoric mounds. Displeased with this turn of events and interference with his research agenda, Powell nevertheless acquiesced and quickly organized a division of mound exploration, eventually appointing Cyrus Thomas to direct investigation of mounds and other archaeological sites east of the Rocky Mountains. A year later, Congress directed Powell to allocate $10,000 for research on the mounds in the Mississippi River Valley and another $10,000 for archaeological investigations in the Southwest. This left him with less than $5,000 for ethnological and linguistic studies he considered more urgent and important. In Powell's view, the prehistoric mounds of the Midwest had been built by various groups. Consequently, the idea of a single mound builder race should be discarded. Thomas, however, initially believed that they were the vestiges of a dense and extinct population whose advance in civilization was much superior to that of known American Indians. During the 1880s, he gathered information on 2,000 mounds, and although his final report did not appear until 1894, his conclusions were already evident a decade earlier. The mounds, in his view, were built either by tribes that resided in those regions when the Europeans arrived or by their ancestors. There was no evidence of any mound builder race that had migrated from either the American tropics or the Old World. And the level of cultural development of those tribes that built the mounds was comparable to that of contemporary Indians who hunted and foraged to gain their own livelihood. Thomas's conclusions had a familiar echo, given that he was carrying out his investigations at the same time as the federal government was actively dispossessing Indians from their homelands in the Mississippi Valley, arguing that they had no claims on these lands since they were wanderers who had not improved the land by investing their labor in the soil in order to reap its harvests. Powell, like his contemporaries, was influenced by the ethnological writings and social evolutionary theory of Lewis Henry Morgan, as well as by the evolutionism of Herbert Spencer and Charles Darwin. He incorporated many of their conclusions in his own writings about American Indians and about the evolution of human society from savagery through barbarism to civilization and finally to enlightenment, where individuals will cooperate rather than compete and law will rest on their equality with one another. His ethnological papers, as well as his theories of progressive development of mankind, were established in the annual reports of the Bureau of Ethnology and the Transactions of the Anthropological Society of Washington, an organization that he and the staff members of the Bureau and the Smithsonian Institution formed in 1879, and the American Anthropologist, which was originally owned by the Anthropological Society of Washington and replaced in its transactions in 1888. Powell played a central role in the foundation of professional anthropology in the United States. He supported and ensured the publication of field investigations of a score of researchers who came from diverse backgrounds. One of the most innovative and original Powell researchers at the American Bureau was James Mooney, an Irish-American newspaper reporter originally from the Midwest. Mooney was concerned with the peoples, mostly American Indian tribes, whose members had been displaced, sold into slavery, and generally abused by the spread of civilization and its agents. In the 1880s, he worked with poor whites and Cherokees in North Carolina. In 1890, he traveled to the West. Shortly after, the U.S. Army had massacred more than 200 men, women, and children at the Pine Ridge Reservation in South Dakota because of their mistaken belief that the dancing associated with the ghost dance religion signaled imminent uprising. For 3 years, Mooney talked with Pout, Arapaho, Sioux, and Kiowa to gain first-hand knowledge. He learned that the ghost dance was a religious movement adopted by a number of Western tribes, whose members were experiencing the dissolution of their own tribal cultures in the wake of deliberate destruction of the great buffalo herds in the 1870s and the influx of settlers into their homelands. He wrote that, "When the race lies crushed and groaning beneath an alien yoke, how natural is the dream of a Redeemer, an author, who shall return from exile or awake from a long sleep to drive out the usurper and win back for his people what they have lost. The hope becomes a faith, and the faith becomes the creed of priests and prophets until the hero is a god and the dream a religion. The doctrines of the Hindu avatar, the Hebrew Messiah, the Christian God, the Hesuman of the Indian ghost dance are essentially the same and have their origin in hope and a longing common to all humanity." When Mooney compared the ghost dance to other religious developments described in the Bible or linked with the growth of humanity, Powell, fearing public and congressional backlash, wrote that the ghost dance was a fantasy belonging to the pre-scriptural stage of culture. Nevertheless, he published Mooney's work without change, and Mooney persisted that his comparisons of the ghost dance with other movements that interruptedly suddenly in times of rapid social and cultural change, when people were forced to seek solace in the wretchedness of their lives in a heartless world. Powell's fears over a political backlash were not without merit. In the late 1880s, he had made powerful enemies in Congress as well as the scientific and business worlds because of his assertion. As director of the U.S. Geological Survey, that the federal government should own water in the West. "Fix it in your own constitution," he told the Senate Select Committee on Irrigation in 1889, "that no corporation, no body of men, no capital can get the possession of the right of your waters. Hold the waters in the hands of the people." Western congressmen and land speculators denounced Powell's conclusions. A few months later, Edward D. Cope, a Philadelphia paleontologist whom Powell had refused to employ earlier, wrote to the New York Herald accusing him and Nathaniel C. Marsh, a survey paleontologist who was the president of the National Academy of Sciences, of attempting to control all the government's scientific work. While Powell weathered Cope's attack, it was used by congressmen, mostly from the West, in an effort to control both the size and the direction of federally supported science. In 1892, his congressional opponents cut 30% from the survey's appropriation and asserted control over how and where the funds allocated should be spent. Powell resigned as director of the Geological Survey in 1894 and devoted the last 8 years of his life to the Bureau of Ethnology. Powell's organizational skills were matched by those of Frederick Ward Putnam, who until his death in 1915 was the driving force behind the growth and success of the Peabody Museum of American Anthropology and Ethnology at Harvard University. Putnam also developed anthropology programs at the Field Museum in Chicago, the American Museum of Natural History, and the University of California in the 1890s. The Peabody Museum was established in 1866 when Nathaniel C. Marsh convinced his uncle, George Peabody, to found an anthropology museum at Harvard. The first curator was Jeffries Wynham, a student of Agassiz who had made anthropometric studies for the U.S. Sanitary Commission during the Civil War and who had subsequently turned his attention to shell middens along the New England coast. When Wyman died, Putnam, a naturalist at the Peabody Academy of Science in Salem and the publisher of the American Naturalist, was selected as his replacement. Putnam's goals were to expand the museum's research collections, to construct a building to house them, and to launch a publication series that would publicize the museum, its holdings, and its work. He continued Wynham's archaeological investigations of the coastal shell middens and to explore mounds in the Ohio Valley, ruins in the Southwest, and glacial deposits for traces of Ice Age inhabitants of the Americas. The first section of the museum building was completed in 1878, the last in 1915. The first of the papers of the Peabody Museum of American Archaeology and Ethnology appeared in 1876, and a series of memoirs launched 2 decades later described the archaeological investigations of individuals affiliated with the museum in Central America and the Yucatan Peninsula. When the Department of American Archaeology and Ethnology was created by Harvard in 1890, teaching provided another outlet for Putnam's abilities. For the next 4 years, however, Putnam's energies were devoted to planning and raising money for a permanent museum in Chicago that would ultimately house the archaeological and ethnological collections made for the upcoming World's Columbian Exposition. In 1891, Putnam was asked to chair the fair's Department of Archaeology and Ethnology, and he took a 3-year leave of absence from Harvard to collaborate with anthropologists from the Bureau of Ethnology and the Smithsonian Institution's National Museum. In the process, he employed more than 50 students and advocates to collect specimens and anthropological data. However, Putnam's, the fair directors, and the Smithsonian scientists had different ideas about the nature of the ethnological exhibits and where they should be located on the fair ground. He proposed an out-of-doors exhibit of the native peoples of America, in their own houses, dressed in their native costumes, and surrounded by their own utensils, implements, and weapons, and the result of their own handiwork. The natives would work quietly in their homes on a wooded island, far from the bustle of the Midway and industrial exhibitions. The Smithsonian scientists wanted to portray Indians living and working in particular environments, as well as in terms of the environment and of the racial hierarchy capped by the white civilized communities, which, as Otis T. Manson remarked, were defined by their reverence for government, their patriotism, and their love of their native land. The directors of the fair demanded that the native peoples live on the Midway, a mile-long strip aside for sideshows and amusements. The political intrigues were intense. Putnam was marginalized by those who preferred the Smithsonian's natural history mode of exhibition and the Midway location for the living ethnological exhibits, and he eventually resigned in 1893. In 1894, Putnam was asked by Morris K. Jessup, president of the American Museum of Natural History, to develop a Department of Archaeology and Ethnology in the New York institution. Putnam accepted a part-time position as curator and spent the next decade seeking money to pay staff members, to launch expeditions, and to purchase specimens. In 1903, he accepted an invitation from Phoebe Apperson Hearst and Benjamin Ide Wheeler to establish an anthropology department and museum of anthropology at the University of California. Hearst's gifts to the university included money for ethnological and linguistic research among Californian Indians, for archaeological investigations in Peru and Egypt, and for research in gravel formations to determine the time when people first arrived in California. However, a downturn in the financial markets in 1904 diminished the flow of Hearst's money, and this led to the curtailment of the field expedition in Peru and to cutbacks in the archaeological and ethnological surveys in California. Once again, Putnam was forced to find the money to keep the operation going. He finally retired from California in 1909 and returned to Cambridge, where he died a few years later. Putnam's intellectual legacy from his career, according to an assistant in Chicago, was to show the advancement of evolution of man. Daniel G. Britton, a physician and professor of ethnology and archaeology at the Academy of Natural Sciences in Philadelphia, also witnessed the professionalization of anthropology in the late 19th century. Brinton lectured and published regularly on American Indian linguistics and ethnology from the 1860s onward. In 1880s and 1890s, he began to lecture and write about racial differences and the hierarchy of races he discerned. Brinton's writings were contradictory. On one hand, he wrote about the psychic unity of mankind, which implied that there were no fundamental differences in mental capacities of peoples from different cultures, since their natural endowments were modified by their circumstances. Hence, a Phrygian who received an education in Europe would be redeemed for civilization. On the other hand, Brinton claimed in his 1895 presidential address on the American Association for the Advancement of Science that black, brown, and the red races differ anatomically so much from the white that even with equal cerebral capacity, they never could rival its results by equal efforts. There were higher and lower races, identified by language, religion, and physical criteria, as a reaffirmation of the polygenic views espoused by Samuel Morton and the other Philadelphia-trained physicians earlier in the century. Brinton's description of races combined physical traits with observations about language, religion, and culture. The 5 races he identified: white Euro-Africans, black Austro-Africans, coppery Americans, brownish Asians, and dark Inuscular peoples, legitimated the common sense categories that had already been used in the political debates for 2 decades and that provided justification for the Jim Crow legislation and anti-immigrationist sentiments of the 1890s. Brinton further claimed that the races, or subspecies, were arranged hierarchically, that the leading race in all history had been the white race, which was divided into 2 branches: the South Mediterranean, whose Semitic and Hamitic members lived from Spain across North Africa to the Middle East, and the North Mediterranean, whose members lived in Europe and were further divided into 3 ancient stocks: the Eurasics, who lived in remote areas south of the Alps, the Caucasians of Eastern Europe, and the widespread Arics or Anglo-Saxons, who originated in Northern Europe. In Brinton's view, the Anglo-Saxons stood at the top of racial hierarchy, while the darker-skinned ones were at the bottom. They were separated by a series of not quite white buffer races: the Caucasian, the Eurasic, the South Mediterranean stocks that had already sent more than 10 million immigrant workers for the stratified labor markets of America's industrial heartland. Powell and Putnam, influenced by ethnological and theoretical writings of Lewis Henry Morgan in particular, and by the theoretical writings of Herbert Spencer in a more general way, were social evolutionists who believed in the progressive development of humanity. Powell, Putnam, and Brinton were also influenced by Spencer's social Darwinism, which, in simplified versions that were popular in the United States, saw and portrayed the development of the human species and society in terms of competition and survival of the fittest. However, not every anthropologist at the turn of the century shared the views of Powell, Putnam, and Brinton concerning the existence of racial hierarchies or the superiority of civilization as a social type, or even that there was a necessarily fixed relation between race, language, and culture. We shall examine these anthropologists and their critiques in the next section. Professionalization, certification, and political commitment. Just as important as the expansion of the industrial production and the closing of the Western frontier, shaping everyday life and popular culture during the Progressive Era, were the genocidal and ethnocidal attacks on American Indians and the rising tide of discrimination against African Americans and immigrants. The Black Codes, a series of state laws enacted in the South from 1865 onward, limited the economic options available to freed men and freed women outside of plantation work, and the Compromise of 1877 effectively blocked blacks from industrial jobs in the North. These were filled in part after 1880 by some of the 23 million immigrants who arrived from southern and eastern Europe, with neither a promise of employment nor the ability to speak English. Additionally, labor violence associated with the Haymarket Riot of 1886 made Native Americans anxious. As a result, foreigners faced unrelenting discrimination and persistent efforts to restrict their entry into the United States. For example, Chinese immigration was restricted after 1882, and the American Protective Association, formed in 1887, sought to ban further immigration of Catholics so that time-honored American policies and traditions would not be disruptive. Anti-Semitism was already so rampant by the late 1870s that Joseph Segelman, a wealthy New York banker and close friend of both Abraham Lincoln and Ulysses S. Grant, was not permitted to register as a guest at the Grant Union Hotel at Sarasota Springs, and the Bernard Brutch was denied membership in a fraternity, in both cases simply because they were Jews. Anti-immigrant sentiments were further heightened in 1894 when Immigration Restriction League was formed by Harvard graduates who sought to maintain America's Anglo-Saxon heritage and traditions, and had the support of Henry Cabot Lodge, U.S. Senator from Massachusetts, who thought they were irreducible differences between the races of men. This was a social milieu in which American anthropology was professionalized, and the profession's career of gravity slowly shifted from the federal government to private museum of the university, thus providing credentials and certification to the next generation of anthropologists. Franz Boaz, who played an important role in this transformation, worked in this milieu and had a profound and immeasurable impact both in his life and his career, since he was a political radical, a foreigner, and a Jew. In 1887, Boaz gave up a position at the Berlin Ethnographic Museum because of Bismarck's anti-liberal policies and rising anti-Semitism in Germany to accept an assistant editorship at Science, the publication of the American Association for the Advancement of Science. Boaz's most perceptive biographer noted that the political commitments shaped his vision of anthropology, and that these commitments were more fundamental than the professionalization of anthropology. Although professionalism is sometimes strong enough to clash successfully with Boaz's politics, professionalism acted as a brake on Boaz's political activism, at least until his later years. On the other hand, professionalism was often an apolitical mask for a deeper political convictions. The intensity of Boaz's politics and its influence on his scholarship are shown by his admission that the only relief was to explode periodically in print, and that he felt a little better for a while. As a university student, Boaz took courses in the sciences, languages, geography, psychophysics, and philosophy. He was also influenced by neo-Kantian thinkers who gave expression to liberal and socialist ideals in the oppressive political climate of Bismarck's Germany during the 1870s and the 1880s. Their views and those of his family underwrote Boaz's lifelong commitment to freedom of thought. He believed that individuals had the right to challenge the authority of tradition in ways that free us from the errors of the past and prevent individualism from outgrowing its legitimate limits and becoming intolerable egotism. The neo-Kantians also maintained that there was a tension between the natural and human sciences. Natural scientists, they argued, seek to explain the relationship of objects, whereas those concerned with the human sciences have to deal with the fact that people think and have some control over the actions. The goal of human scientists was to understand the forms people construct to explain their experiences. The fact that knowledge was always produced from particular points of view raised questions for Boaz regarding the role of subjective mental activity in the perception of the external world. It put the problem he investigated in his doctoral dissertation, Perceptions of the Color of Water in New Light. A year-long sojourn with the Inuit community in Buffinland in 1883 taught Boaz that the color of water, which could be measured precisely with scientific instruments, was not perceived the same way by Germans and Inuit. He would conclude that the differences could not be explained solely by reference to the natural environments in which they lived. Boaz was concerned with the relationship of the objective and the subjective worlds, the connection between the physical and the psychic. In order to understand their interconnection, it was necessary to look behind appearances to get at the genius of people, its culture, the fundamental elements that constituted the character of its members and gave meaning to their lives, elements that were modified by geography and history, that incorporated foreign materials, and that were transmitted from one generation to the next. Culture, for Boaz and the Neo-Cagtons, was relatively autonomous totality with interrelated parts. In the 1880s, Boaz saw culture embodied in the folklore and sentiments of people, which manifested what its members considered good and bad, commendable and objectionable, beautiful and otherwise. Their mythology embraced their whole concept of the world, their individuality, their genius, and gave a clear insight into the passions that moved them. Since cultures could be compared, an understanding of one culture could provide insights into and questions about other cultures. Boaz's ideas built on the legacy of Johann Herder, a 18th century supporter of the French Revolution and the Declaration of Rights of Man, as well as a critic of the German nobility. Herder had distinguished civilization from culture. Civilization was, in his view, mechanical and associated with state. It erased people's knowledge, their shared patterns of thought, their understanding of everyday life. That is, civilization destroyed the spontaneity and creativity of authentic culture, which was rooted in the thoughts and the language of people who lived in remote, relatively unstratified communities. The residues of Boaz's views that persist to the present are his recognition of the plurality of cultures and his cultural relativism. He believed that anthropologists gained understanding of a culture through first-hand experience with living peoples and how they understood their conditions of existence. He also argued that indigenous understandings were not the same as systematic ethnology, even though they were brought to for those things that interested the people themselves. In his view, the anthropologist's reason for understanding culture ultimately had different foundations from the motives of the members of that group. Boaz's cultural relativism was complex. This methodology, it assumed anthropologists were able to suspend, at least temporarily, the values and viewpoints of their own culture to assume those of the cultures they were studying. However, the study of different cultures was not, in his view, an invitation to promote relativistic attitudes in which nothing was stable, or relativistic attitudes toward ethical standards. The comparative study of cultures provided Boaz with the materials and incentives to transcend the limitations, both cultural relativism and ethnocentrism. It led him to write that his ideals have developed because I am what I am and have lived where I lived, and it is my purpose to work for these ideals, because I am by nature active, because the conditions of our culture that run counter to my ideals stimulate me to action. Shortly after Boaz arrived in the United States in 1887, he launched a critique of cultural evolutionary thought, which viewed human history as the end product of a universal unilinear process that began with savagery and progressed through barbarism to civilization. While he accepted the idea that evolution was historical development, he rejected claims that all societies necessarily followed the same course of development or that all societies necessarily moved from simple to more complex conditions. The focus of his critique was the way that Otis T. Manson, the curator of ethnology at the National Museum, had organized its exhibits. Each exhibit was an orthogenetic arrangement of a particular class of objects, such as cooking pots, masks, or woodworking tools, that purportedly represented their development from earlier, simpler forms to more recent, more complex ones. Boaz argued that Manson's classifications did not constitute explanations of historical development of those objects, because the objects themselves were not related. They had been wrenched from the social context of the groups in which they were made and used and had meaning. Boaz stressed the importance of explaining ethnological collections in terms of the histories of the cultural groups to whom they belonged. Boaz's views about the theoretical underpinnings of Manson Museum exhibits, as well as the earlier critique of environmental determinism, were already major sources of annoyance to the Washington Anthropologist by the time of the World's Columbian Exposition in Chicago, where he worked as Putnam's assistant. Like Putnam, Boaz was also marginalized by the fair's trustees, and he resigned shortly after William H. Holmes was named director of the Department of Anthropology at the Field Museum in 1894. For the next 2 years, Boaz was only sporadically employed. During this period, he worked for a few months for Putnam at the American Museum of Natural History. However, in the winter of 1895 and 96, Putnam succeeded in getting Boaz an appointment as a special assistant at the museum and as another lecturer at Columbia University for the 1896 and 97 academic year. In spite of his precarious financial position during this period, Boaz still continued his critique of the theory and practice of American anthropology. This time he focused his attention on the correlation between race and culture that Brinton and others presumed. At the 1894 meeting of the American Association for the Advancement of Science, he questioned whether there was a correlation between racial type and level of cultural development, whether there was a hierarchy of racial types, and whether the white race had a greater aptitude for producing civilization than did other racial types. In a word, he challenged their racialist theories and racist attitudes they buttressed into a wider society. When he pointed out that the variations inside any single race are such that they overlap variations in another race, so that the number of characteristics may be common to individuals in both races, he came close to challenging the utility of the race concept itself as an analytical category. An examination of the historical development of early civilizations in the Old World led him to conclude that they were not the product of a particular race, but rather the amalgamation of ideas that were derived from and shared by diverse races. In other words, historical events appear to have been much more potent in leading races to civilization than their facility, and it follows that achievements of races do not warrant us to assume that one race is more highly gifted than another. Boaz also pointed out that while there was no relation between racial type and cultural development, racism supported by racialist theories presented a formidable obstacle to the advance and progress of African Americans in the United States. 2 years later, Boaz extended his critique of the hegemonic cultural evolutionary theories in the United States. He pointed out that when Brinton and others sought to discover the laws that govern the development of society, they assumed that particular traits were characteristic of certain stages of development, and that societies exhibiting those traits had necessarily experienced the same processes of growth and had consequently followed the same developmental pathway. In contrast to their efforts to construct a uniform systematic history of evolution of culture, Boaz advocated comparative studies of historical circumstances in which various people emerged and the growth processes that were actually involved in the development of these cultures. In 1891, while he was teaching at the psychology department at Clark University, Boaz launched the first of his studies of human growth and development. Unlike his contemporaries, who were mainly concerned with establishing standard growth curves, Boaz showed that children in fact grew at different rates, that the growth of a typical individual might be accelerated by relative to those standard growth curves at one period and retarded at another, and that the variations in tempo of growth were characteristic of both mental development and physical growth. Like some of his contemporaries, Boaz knew that the growth and development of children were affected by their social circumstances, Upper-class boys and girls were larger than children at the same age raised in less affluent circumstances. During the next 2 decades, he would extend those studies to children in Oakland, Toronto, Atlanta, Puerto Rico, and the Hebrew Orphan Home in New York, and the undertake longitudinal growth study of children enrolled in a private school near New York. In 1905, Boaz was one of the experts employed in the U.S. Immigration Commission that was established by President Theodore Roosevelt. Boaz and his assistants were charged with investigating the effects of the American environment on immigrants and their children. They measured 17,821 subjects and concluded that the head form was not stable, as most students of race believed, but rather that it changed relatively quickly in response to environmental factors. He wrote that the adaptability of the immigrant seems to be very much greater than we had the right to suppose before our investigations were instituted. Not even those characteristics of race which have been proved to be the most permanent in their old home remain the same under new surroundings, and now we are compelled to conclude that when these features of the body change, the whole bodily and mental makeup of the immigrants may change. These results are so definite that heretofore we had a right to assume that human types are stable. All evidence is now in favor to the great plasticity of human types, and the permanence of types in new surroundings appears rather as the exception to the rule. Once again, Boaz challenged established views, both in the wider society and in the emerging professionalism. The U.S. Immigration Commission dismissed Boaz's claims, arguing that there are no more corroborating evidence. Boaz was understandably outraged in 1924 when Congress passed the Immigration Restriction Act, whose nationalism, xenophobia, and racism he deplored as a Nordic nonsense. Boaz's views on racism and his studies of child growth ultimately led to an invitation from W.E.B. Du Bois to measure African American children in Atlanta and to participate in a conference on the Negro physique at Atlanta University in 1906. Boaz agreed to give the commencement address that year. His acceptance of the invitation placed him in the middle of the struggle for racial equality. It allied him with the vindicationist wing led by Du Bois, which argued for integration, and put him in opposition of the faction led by Booker T. Washington at the Carnegie, supported by Tuskegee Institute, which stressed acquisition of skills and property as well as maintenance of existing social order. The National Association for the Advancement of Colored People was founded in 1910. Boaz was a charter member and wrote about the race problem for its magazine, The Crisis. Boaz's participation for the struggles of social justice and racial equality was not confined to lecturing, joining organizations, and writing articles. In the fall of 1906, he attempted to establish an African American museum in New York to counteract racism. He solicited funds from Andrew Carnegie, John D. Rockefeller, and 2 supporters of Negro education, George Peabody and Robert Ogden. All of them declined to provide financial support for the project. Then he turned to the Bureau of American Ethnology, which also declined to support it because it might arouse race feeling in Congress and jeopardize the Bureau's appropriations. Boaz also sought and finally got some financial support from Carter J. Woodson, Ellis Clues Parsons, and George Peabody to support and train African American students at Columbia. Boaz's participation in civil rights struggles was not confined to immigrants and African Americans. In 1915, he wrote to a U.S. senator arguing that women should be granted the same privileges enjoyed by men. 2 years later, he took up the cause of the Wacolio Indians when the federal government threatened to enact legislation that would prohibit the potlatch. He informed the government that this would cause great hardship and that should not restrict Indian practices simply because a particular custom was alien to American culture. The profession of anthropology was restructured at the turn of the 20th century. This reorganization had two major dimensions. First was the formation of the National Professional Organization, the American Anthropological Association, with its own journal, the American Anthropologist. It was published in the context of local anthropological studies that included professionals who gained their livelihoods from anthropological inquiries as well as amateurs. The Washington Anthropologists wanted to include a membership policy for the new organization. Other members of the Washington group prevailed until the organization created by Executive Committee in 1912, which marked the beginning of a shift in the balance of power in the profession from individuals employed by the government and museums to those with academic credentials and university affiliations. The second dimension of the reorganization involved the emergence of graduate training programs in anthropology at Harvard, Columbia, Chicago, the University of Pennsylvania, and the University of California at Berkeley. By 1912, these institutions had awarded doctorates in anthropology to 20 men. During the 2 decades, there was more than fourfold increase. By the 1928, a total of 53 men and 9 women had received PhD degrees in anthropology. Harvard and Columbia granted the largest number of degrees. 24 men received doctorates from Harvard, and Boaz had supervised the dissertations of 15 men and 7 women in Columbia. In spite of the rapidly growing number of anthropologists with university certification, the profession was still small, and the process of reorganization and centralization proceeded slowly in the early decades of the 20th century. One reason for this continued existence or formation of local or regional anthropological societies whose members could effectively challenge the hegemony of Washington anthropologists and Boaz's intellectual leadership. The career of Edward Lee Hewitt is a case in point. Hewitt was a Midwestern school teacher who became interested in Southwest archaeology in the 1890s. With friends, he founded the Archaeological Society of New Mexico in 1898, and within a few years became recognized as the spokesman for archaeology in the West. Hewitt gained national preeminence in the passage of Antiquities Act in 1906. From 1904 onward, Congress debated the merits of several alternative bills, one backed by the Smithsonian, the American Anthropological Association, and the Archaeological Institute of America, and another proposed by Hewitt, who enlisted the aid of politically powerful Charles Loomis of Los Angeles. The Westerners argued that the bill supported by the Easterners gave the Smithsonian too much control over local archaeological sites. Hewitt-Loomis' version became law. Hewitt's tactics particularly annoyed Boaz and Putnam, but apparently not W. H. Holmes and Jesse Fox at the Smithsonian Institution, with whom he had close personal relations. At the same time, Hewitt successfully lobbied the Archaeological Institute of America to establish a school of American archaeology in Santa Fe, with himself as the director and his salary paid by the Institute. In 1907, he launched an archaeological field school, which was attended by 2 Harvard students, Alfred V. Kidder and Salvis Morley, both whom would soon become prominent archaeologists in the United States. 2 years later, the politically connected Hewitt convinced the state legislature to establish the Museum of New Mexico. In the process, Hewitt cemented his reputation in the Midwest as the leader in the emerging profession. Hewitt had consolidated his position and influence by 1910 and was able to beat back criticism of his research and the administration of the school in Santa Fe. For example, in 1909, Putnam Boaz and Charles Bowditch, who were critical of Hewitt's research and opportunism, took their criticisms to the annual meeting of Archaeological Institute of America and lost. Hewitt's schools and activities took money and other resources that Putnam, Boaz, and Bowditch wanted to use to support the International School of American Archaeology and Ethnology in Mexico. In 1910, Hewitt allegedly made statements impugning Boaz's integrity. Boaz responded publicly, once again, criticized Hewitt's administration of the school in Santa Fe. Hewitt's friend, William H. Holmes, who by this time had succeeded Powell as director of Bureau of Ethnology and had his own axe to grind, came to his aid and cut off the Bureau's financial support of Boaz's ongoing linguistic research. As a result of his political connections and tactics, Hewitt had shaping effect on the development of American anthropology from 1904 through the mid-1920s. His influence and prominence, especially in the Midwest and West, were virtually unchallenged until he tangled with John D. Rockefeller Jr. over the fate of Santa Fe in the mid-1920s. Hewitt's stature and political connections were such that any anthropologist seeking to work in the American Southwest, particularly in New Mexico, from 1910 onward had to get his approval before beginning his or her studies. This included the pioneering archaeological investigation of Neil C. Nelson and of A.V. Kidder in the years immediately preceding the First World War. The first stratigraphic excavations and dating of artifacts in the area among the first uses of stratigraphy in the United States, which were carried out with his consent. Stratigraphic excavations and the recognition of cultural stratigraphy marked the beginning of a methodological revolution in the American archaeology. By the 1920s, Kidder was emerging as a major figure in American archaeology. This was particularly because of the high quality of his investigations at Pecos. More importantly, however, it was the result of his administrative skills, the annual conferences he organized at Pecos, and the field experience and research opportunities that he provided for students and younger scholars. Kidder collaborated with, trained, or influenced most of the next generation of archaeologists who worked in the American Southwest or the Carnegie Institution of Washington in southern Mexico and Central America. In 1901, Andrew Carnegie used $10 million of the United States Steel Corporation bonds to establish the Carnegie Institution of Washington to promote original research and to discover the exceptional man in every department of study, whenever and wherever found, inside or outside schools, and enable him to make the work for which he seems specifically designed his life work. In the first years of its existence, the Carnegie provided minor grants for W. H. Holmes' studies of early man in the Americas, and Robert S. Woodward, its president, consulted with Boaz and other former colleagues at Columbia about the possibility of moving into new fields of inquiry. By 1911, he was convinced that the Department of Anthropology should be formed. However, William Barclay Parsons, an engineer and one of the Carnegie trustees, pushed for Central American archaeology and got the enthusiastic support of other trustees. A long search was launched, and the lobbying intense. Sylvanus Morley, who proposed to conduct archaeological investigation in Ch.2 in southern Mexico, was finally selected in 1914. Holmes and Frederick W. Hodge at the Smithsonian supported his candidacy over that of Alfred Tauser, who had the support of Putnam, Bowditch, and perhaps Boaz. Hewitt apparently tried to derail Morley's candidacy by criticizing the project his employee had proposed. The Mexican government, which recently enacted strict Antiquities Act to control the movement of antiquities from the country, approved Carnegie's project at Chichen Itza with the proviso that no artifacts could be permanently removed from the Yucatan Peninsula. Morley began his archaeological investigations almost immediately. The program flourished and grew. However, in 1925, Thomas Gann, a physician affiliated with the project and a close personal friend of Morley's, purchased a pre-Columbian jade object and smuggled it out of the country. The Mexican authorities, Manuel Gamio, a former student of Boaz, learned that the jade had been exported illegally by a member of Morley's staff and complained to John C. Merriam, the Carnegie's president, who contacted his friend A.V. Kidder for advice. The jade was returned and presented to the Mexican government as a gift. However, the reputation of Carnegie was tarnished. An advisory committee was formed to reorganize the project and to expand the scope of its investigations to include ethnology, ethnohistory, geology, geography, climatology, botany, zoology, physical anthropology, and linguistics. In 1929, Miriam asked Kidder to become director of Carnegie's new division of historical research and of its Middle American research program. Shortly after the armistice ending the First World War, Boaz was outraged by the information he acquired regarding Morley and the 3 other archaeologists associated with Carnegie or with the International School of American Archaeology and Ethnology in Mexico. They were spies who used anthropology as a front for their espionage activities in Central America and Mexico during the First World War. Boaz had already angered people with strong patriotic sentiments when he denounced patriotism on the pages of the New York Times, opposed the United States' entry into the First World War, which he considered a clash between imperialist states, and publicly announced his membership in the Socialist Party in 1918. That anthropologists whom he knew or supported, Morley, H.E. Mechling, who attended the International School in Mexico City, Herbert Spinded of the American Museum of Natural History, and J. Alden Manson of the University of Pennsylvania were spies as seen by Boaz as more than a personal betrayal. Without naming them, he told the readers of The Nation that they had prostituted science by using it as a cover for their activities as spies. They were not the only anthropologists to serve in the Army or Navy intelligence during the First World War. Kidder, William C. Farabee of the University of Pennsylvania, Marshall Salvey, who was Boaz's earnest colleague at Columbia, and Samuel Lothrop, who purchased collections in Nicaragua and Costa Rica for George Yee, also served in military intelligence units. Boaz's article in The Nation incensed a majority of the anthropological community in the United States. On December 30th, 1919, the Anthropological Association adopted in Cambridge, by vote of 21 to 10, to censure the motion prepared by W.H. Holmes, which read, that the expression of the opinion of Dr. Franz Boaz contained in an open letter to the editor of The Nation, under the date of October 16, 1919, was published in the issue of that weekly for December 20, 1919, is unjustified and does not represent the opinion of the American Anthropological Association. Be it further that a copy of this resolution be forwarded to the Executive Board of the National Research Council and other scientific association as may have been taken action on this matter. It is further respectfully asked that in the name of Americanism as against un-Americanism, that Dr. Franz Boaz and also the 10 members of the Anthropological Association who by voting against the latter resolution, thus supporting him in his disloyalty, be excluded from participation in any service respecting which any question of loyalty to the United States government may be properly raised. To question the honor of the President of the United States is a disloyal act. To criticize and to make public the secret measures of military service before peace is signed, with apparent intent to embarrass scientific researches on the part of certain students in foreign countries, is a doubly disloyal act. To support disloyalty, as it was actively supported in Cambridge by certain members of the American Anthropological Association, is a distinct disloyalty act and should be recognized as such. Boaz and his followers have sought to gain control of and direct anthropological researches in this country, especially those undertaken on behalf of the nation. There appears no danger that the National Research Council may give this group control of researches and measures affecting the most intimate and vital interests of the nation, interests that should be entrusted those and only those standard of citizenship is wholly above criticism. In the days immediately following the adoption of this resolution, Holmes urged patriot scientist Charles D. Walcott his former colleague at the Geological Survey, who had become secretary of the Smithsonian Institution, to use his influence to get Boaz expelled from the National Academy of Sciences. Holmes also supplied Walcott with a hearsay evidence that Boaz was a German spy. Walcott apparently forwarded this information to A. Mitchell Palmer, the U.S. Attorney General, who conducted a thorough investigation of Boaz's activities and found nothing implicating him in a pernicious radical activities. However, within the next few months, Boaz was forced to withdraw his candidacy for a seat on the National Research Council, which was presided over by John C. Merriam, who would soon become the president of the Carnegie Institution of Washington. Within a few years, at least one of Boaz's supporters, Robert H. Lowe, who was at the American Museum of Natural History, felt sufficiently pressured by the conditions in which he worked, either to revise his political views or at least stop expressing them publicly, in a period before Attorney General Palmer began to disrupt radical political labor organizations by arresting and deporting their members. The Palmerays, as they were called, were led by J. Edgar Hoover, an ambitious patriot, racist, and xenophobe who used the attacks to establish himself as the first director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. While patriotism precipitated Boaz's censure, the latter also involved old divisions and antagonisms. Of 21 individuals who supported the censure, 15 identified themselves as archaeologists, 10 of whom worked in Mexico or Central America. 3 others described themselves as physical anthropologists, 12 were trained at Harvard, and 3 were employed by the federal government. At the time, Harvard Mayanist A.M. Tauser called them the Mayan Washington crowd. 6 of the 10 individuals who supported Boaz, by opposing the censure motion, identified themselves as ethnologists. They included 6 former students and 2 close associates, several of whom who were political radical Jews whose parents emigrated earlier from Central Europe. Struggles over the future of anthropology, 1916 to 1932. 3 distinct conceptions of anthropology existed during and after the First World War. Briefly, the one crafted by Franz Boaz and his students argued that culture, rather than race, determined behavior and stressed the interconnections of ethnology, linguistics, folklore, archaeology, and physical anthropology. The second one, crafted by Alice Hertliga of the National Museum, asserted the primacy of the biology and attempted to establish physical anthropology as an autonomous academic discipline. The third was that of Charles B. Davenport and another spokesman of the eugenics movement, who were direct heirs of the late 19th century social Darwinism. They saw eugenics as a practical science and viewed all human differences in terms of hereditary and rank-ordered racial hierarchy, with white Anglo-Saxon Protestants at the top and other groups arranged below them in terms of decreasing whiteness. The National Research Council was an important arena for the struggle of the proponents of these views as the war ended and peace reappeared. The National Research Council was established in 1916 as a means of mobilizing science and research for the war effort. The NRC would acquire a permanent status in 1918 as the result of an executive order signed by President Woodrow Wilson. The executive order was engineered by Elihu Root and George E. Hale, both whom were affiliated with the Carnegie Corporation, the umbrella organization which linked together Andrew Carnegie's various philanthropies and whose board of trustees had publicly acknowledged its wish to preserve Anglo-Saxon prerogatives, customs, and genes. The formation of the NRC coincided with the heyday of eugenics movement in the United States, whose proponents claimed that the Anglo-Saxon race was being swamped by all the babies that were being born to members of inferior races. At a practical level, the eugenicists argued for sterilization, selective breeding, and restricting the immigration of peoples from Eastern and Southern Europe and of individuals with dark skins. The formation of the NRC also coincided with racial union organizing and labor agitation by workers who were drawn largely from the races deemed inferior by eugenicists and the wealthy capitalists who supported them. Carnegie, Mary Harriman, John D. Rockefeller, the Kellogg family, which made breakfast cereal, and the Henry Fairfield Osborn, who was president of the American Museum of Natural History. In the fall of 1916, George E. Hale, the director of the NRC, turned to W. H. Holmes, rather than Boaz, to organize its Committee on Anthropology. Holmes immediately discussed this with Alice Hrdlicka, his longtime associate and ally at the National Museum, whom he wanted on the committee. Holmes and Hrdlicka faced a dilemma. They were not anxious to have Boaz, the recognized leader of American anthropology, or any of his allies in the profession, on the committee. They feared that Boaz would seize control of the committee's research agenda, and that this would give him and his students unprecedented control over the direction of American anthropology. Moreover, Boaz's conception of anthropology as a practical and composed of ethnology, linguistics, folklore, archaeology, and physical anthropology was distinctly at odds with that of Hrdlicka, who had long campaigned to establish physical anthropology as an independent discipline. His recommendations of January 15, 1917, to Hale, Holmes followed Hrdlicka and proposed that the investigations of the Committee of Anthropology would have in view the betterment of people of the nation, are concerned most exclusively with the practical side, with the man that is to be, with his physique, his functions, and mentality, his hereditary and eugenics, his sociology, hygiene, and pathology. The names Holmes proposed for a membership on the committee were those of Hrdlicka, Boaz, and Davenport. The list also included a number of physicians whose main qualification was that they controlled facilities where the investigations Hrdlicka proposed could be carried out. Hale balked when he saw Holmes' proposal. He was disturbed by the biomedical thrust of the inquiries, by Holmes' disregard for the selection procedures established by the NRC that mandated cooperation with the American Anthropological Association, which Boaz and his allies controlled, and perhaps by Holmes' reluctance to nominate his friend, James H. Breasted, the Egyptologist at the University of Chicago, for the Committee on Anthropology. Holmes gained a temporary edge when President Wilson broke diplomatic relations with Germany and the other Central Powers on February 3, 1917, a move that Boaz denounced as a declaration of war in the New York Times. Because of the letter, Hale recommended to Holmes that Boaz be dropped from the committee. Holmes agreed, but he dropped both Boaz and Davenport. In April 1917, Holmes told Hrdlicka that Madison Grant, whose best-selling Passage of the Great Race had been published a year earlier, offered to provide financial assistance for the committee's work in exchange for a membership on it. Grant was a wealthy New York lawyer, racist propagandist, and virulent anti-Semite who had presumably learned of Holmes' problems from his friend Harry Fairfield Osborn at the American Museum, who was also a friend and confidant of Hale. In spite of reservations about Grant's book and the value of eugenics research in general, Hrdlicka followed Holmes' advice. He readily took Grant's money, and with less enthusiasm, accepted his membership on the committee. Boaz expressed his outrage over Grant's inclusion in the Committee on Anthropology in letter to Hale, who forwarded it to Holmes. When Hrdlicka saw the letter, he asked Holmes to fill the remaining spot on the committee with Davenport. Holmes did so, and that turned out to be a mistake. By December 1917, Grant and Davenport were disgruntled. Grant perceived correctly that Hrdlicka only wanted his money, and Davenport realized that Hrdlicka had no interest in his eugenic investigations. Grant complained to Hale that the committee was unable to implement the survey because it did not agree on the design of anthropometric form that should be used. In Grant's opinion, the committee had become preoccupied with establishing Hrdlicka's Physical Anthropology Journal. Holmes and Hrdlicka met with Hale on January 4, 1918, in order to clarify and resolve the issues. Hale supported Davenport's proposals and told them to use anthropometric schedule Davenport employed at the Eugenics Record Office because it would give scientifically comparable results. Holmes attempted to re-sign, pointing out that he had been appointed chairman of the Committee on Anthropology and not on the Committee of Anthropology and Eugenics. Hrdlicka also threatened to resign, but Hale asked him to explain in detail his objections to Davenport's research project. Hale did not accept their resignations immediately in order to forestall embarrassing questions. In February 1918, Hale chose Davenport, not Holmes or Hrdlicka, to represent the interests of the Committee on Anthropology to the Division of Medicine and Related Sciences of the NRC. Holmes resubmitted his resignation a month later, and Hrdlicka responded by requesting that Clark Whistler, a student of Boaz who was employed at the American Museum of Natural History, be added to the committee, and by adding Boaz and his two allies, Alfred Kroeber and Berthold Laufer, to the editorial board of his American Journal of Physical Anthropology. In March, Davenport and Grant attempted to consolidate their position on the Committee on Anthropology and to eliminate possible interference from Boaz, the American Anthropological Association. With the backing of Henry F. Osborne, they established a rival anthropological society, the Galton Society for the Study of Origin and Evolution of Man, which was centered in New York City at the American Museum of Natural History. Grant wrote that the membership of the new society would be self-elected and self-permeating and very limited in members, and also confined to Native Americans who were anthropologically, socially, and politically sound. No Bolsheviks need apply. Davenport chaired the new society, which included prominent eugenicists on the NRC, at the American Museum of Natural History, and in universities. Its membership was soon expanded to include Clark Whistler of the American Museum of Natural History and Harvard physical anthropologist Ernest A. Houghton. In April, Davenport reported that the NRC's Committee on Anthropology would be reorganized as a section in the Division of Medicine and Related Sciences. It would consist of 4 subcommittees that would investigate the anthropometry of men who had inducted into the Army, race in relation to disease, the races of Europe, and the race in relation to psychology. Hrdlicka was not satisfied. However, in a memo to Hale, Hrdlicka complained that the committee, which once had such great prospects, and which there was so much of my own, is now divided into a number of no further related small bodies, and I am to fill pro forma secretaryship in a little body with the prospects of success of which have become such that its head is practically thrown in the sponge. From Hrdlicka's vantage, it must have seemed that fate intervened once again, for John C. Merriam, paleontologist, Galton Society member, and future president of the Carnegie Institution of Washington, was named in May 1918 to oversee the NRC's peacetime conversion. One of Merriam's first acts was to ship Hrdlicka to New York to work on a confidential report being prepared under the direction of Isaiah Bauman at the American Geographical Society. For the next 6 months, Hrdlicka wrote about the ethnology of Eastern Europe. Merriam, who had also taught anthropology for a number of years at Berkeley earlier in his career, was concerned with the problem of organization in anthropology. He quickly decided that it should have a close relation with psychology. His intentions became clearer. However, in a lecture he delivered to the members of the Galton Society in December 1918, the problem with anthropology, he argued, was that anthropologists had focused too narrowly on the problems associated with American Indians, and that they had failed to convince university administrators that the problems they investigated were in fact of universal concern. This, of course, was mainly an attack on Boaz and his students. Later that month, he addressed a joint meeting of the American Anthropological Association and Section H of the American Association for the Advancement of Science, indicating that each group should appoint a single representative that would become the NRC Division of Anthropology and Psychology. Boaz responded that the responsibility for organizing and directing anthropology should not come from individuals, but rather from representatives of the three main subfields selected by the members of the AAA and the AAAS. Boaz agreed with Miriam that the scope of anthropology should be expanded, but he also recognized the difficulties he had experienced throughout his career attempting to find funding overseas research. Hrdlicka was displeased because Boaz had not paid enough attention to physical anthropology and wanted to work on human paleontology and racial anthropology among the white and Negro populations of the United States. In July 1919, Miriam announced the organization of the Division of Anthropology and Psychology. There would be 9 anthropologists and 9 psychologists. The AAA would select 6 members, and the NRC Executive Committee would appoint 3. Hrdlicka, who was still a member of the NRC's Committee on Anthropology, approached Clark Whistler, the AAA president, to select 6 delegates. A list of nominees drawn up by the AAA Executive Committee was sent to the members. Boaz, Whistler, Kroeber, Laufer, Jesse Fox, and Roland B. Dixon were selected. Holmes was outraged because Hrdlicka had not been elected to the new NRC committee. Boaz's remedy, place Hrdlicka on the committee and stagger the terms of the members, was accepted. Boaz, Hrdlicka, and Whistler were appointed for 1 year, while other members had 2 or 3-year terms. Boaz was forced to resign from the Division of Anthropology and Psychology after his letter exposing 4 anonymous anthropologists who had spied in Latin America during the war appeared in the Nation. He was replaced by F.W. Hodge of the Bureau of American Ethnology. Hrdlicka was not re-elected and was replaced by James H. Breasted, whom the NRC Executive Committee appointed. Whistler, who was the elected chair of the division, recommended 6 projects to the NRC. 1. A study of racial groups and populations in the United States. 2. Intelligence testing of college students. 3. The stimulation of graduate work. 4. An anthropometric survey of college students. 5. Archaeological surveys. And 6. A study of race mixture in Hawaii. In 1926, Hrdlicka, who had been reappointed to the committee 2 years earlier, proposed that the NRC establish a committee to undertake anthropological and psychological studies of American Negroes. A committee that included Boaz, Hrdlicka, Davenport, Houghton, and Kidder was elected to oversee this research. Hrdlicka wanted a research institute in Washington. Other members agreed with Boaz's suggestion to carve up the work among individuals or institutions whose work could then be efficiently managed by the committee. By the mid-1920s, the terrain of struggle between forces led Boaz, Hrdlicka, and Davenport had changed significantly. Congressional testimony provided by Davenport and funded indirectly by the Carnegie Institution of Washington was used as an ideological justification for the Johnson Act of 1924, which established immigration quotas based on the 1890 census. Since the vast majority of the immigrants were from Eastern and Southern Europe after 1890, this meant that only relatively few individuals from that region would be accepted each year. The eugenicists also provided an ideological justification for the enactment of sterilization and misgenication laws in numerous states during the 1920s and 1930s. At the same time, however, geneticists such as L.C. Dunn and H.J. Miller in the United States and J.B. Haldens in England were raising serious objections to eugenics as a field of inquiry. Their critiques merged with those of individuals opposed the eugenicists' political activities. In 1929, Miriam, who was now president of the Carnegie Institution of Washington, began to examine what the institution had received in return for nearly $3 million it had invested in Davenport's eugenics research programs since 1904. He appointed a committee that included L.C. Dunn, Kidder, and Whistler to evaluate the data. The committee concluded that Davenport's data relied on the subjective assessments of field workers and that his claims about individual traits needed to be tested with more precise quantitative. Miriam convened a second panel in 1936 that included Dunn, Houghton, Adolf Schwartz, and Robert Redfield. This committee concluded that Davenport's data were virtually worthless. 3 years later, Vannevar Bush, Miriam's successor, edited support for Davenport's projects. The eugenics movement was transformed with Rockefeller's support as its focus shifted from hereditary to population control and birth control experiments on an international scale. While Hrdlicka was unable to convince either the directors of the Smithsonian Institution or the NRC's Department of Anthropology and Psychology to convert his division at the National Museum into a full-fledged research and teaching institute, he did succeed in making the National Museum a major research and training center. He also used the American Journal of Physical Anthropology, which first appeared in 1918, to establish a small network of researchers, many of whom were anatomists in medical schools. Realizing that many of the subscribers were also members of the Section H of the American Association for the Advancements of Science, he began to garner support among them for an independent association of physical anthropology. During the next year, the organizing committee of the new American Association of Physical Anthropologists recruited 83 members, 47 anatomists, 2 physicians, 18 zoologists, and 18 anthropologists, only 8 whom were full-time physical anthropologists. One goal of the new association was to further teaching and research in human phylogeny, autogeny, variation, and differentiation. During the 1920s, cultural determinists, Boaz, and younger anthropologists, notably Ralph Linton, Melville J. Herskovits, and Margaret Mead, reasserted the hegemony of their views within the profession and challenged the hegemony of that of the eugenicist views in the wider society when they attacked the methodology of racial intelligence testing used by psychologists. Linton concluded that the intelligence tests used by the U.S. Army were more dependent on education and social opportunity than race, and that the differences revealed cannot be induced as proof as racial inequality. Mead pointed out that the existing studies of racial mental differences failed to control for either social status differences or the effects of language use patterns. Herskovits was critical of the studies that purportedly showed a correlation between the degree of racial admixture and intelligence. His examination of a diverse group of Howard University freshmen with similar educational backgrounds showed no correlation between purportedly Negro physical traits and test scores. At the end of the decade, Boaz reinstated his views about the linkage between race and culture. I do not believe that any convincing proof has ever been given of a direct relation between race and culture. It is true enough that human cultures and racial types are so distributed that every area has its own type and its own culture, but this does not prove that one determines the form of the other. The error of modern theories is due largely to a faulty extension of the concept of individual hereditary to that of racial hereditary. Hereditary acts only in lines of direct descent. There is no unity of descent in any of the existing races, and we have no right to assume that mental characteristics of a few selected family lines are shared by all members of a race. On the contrary, all large races are so variable, and the functional characteristics of the component hereditary lines are so diverse that similar family lines may be found in all races, particularly all in closely related local types, divisions of the same race. Hereditary characteristics when socially significant, have a cultural value, as in all cases of race discrimination or in those cultural conditions in which specially gifted line is given the opportunity to impress itself upon the general culture. This concept of culture was different from the one that Boaz had deployed at the beginning of the 20th century. His earlier concept of culture had emerged of the coalescence of two independent lines of inquiry, one concerned with folklore and the other with the purported racial mental differences. Following Neo-Caton writers, Boaz believed that the genius of the people, its culture, was found in its language, knowledge, skills, arts, and mythology. In other words, the folklore of a tribe, which could be collected relatively easily, embodied the ethical prescriptions of its members and described what constituted their ethical behavior. His studies of the folklore of Northwest Coast tribes showed, however, that many of the elements of their mythologies had been borrowed from neighboring peoples, reworked and reinterpreted to make them conform with the ethical beliefs and values of the borrowers. These stories, their culture, were transmitted from one generation to the next, and more importantly, children learned them in context of the present, rather in terms of how the various elements were added to the whole. In other words, he viewed the Northwest Coast tribes as a set of historically conditioned, interacting totalities, rather than in terms of a sequence of developmental stages. He further argued that, while the history of the industrial development showed evidence of Spearsian progress, other human activities that do not depend on reasoning do not show a similar type of evolution. Boaz's views about the purported mental differences of races developed along different lines. He disagreed with studies which linked racial and cultural evolutionary hierarchies and proclaimed that the mental capabilities of dark-skinned primitive peoples were inferior to those of civilized white peoples of Northern Europe. When he discussed the issue in the 1890s, he typically found alternative explanations for the differences that were rooted in cultural or social realms rather than race or cranial capacity. By 1901, he had turned to studies in experimental psychology, such as one carried out by British anthropologists Alfred C. Haddon and W.H.R. Rivers in the Torres Straits, which showed that there were no significant differences between the sensory abilities of the primitive peoples of the coast of New Guinea and those of civilized men in Europe. In Boaz's view, this meant that all peoples had the same mental organization governing the same fundamental psychological processes. Thus, the behavioral differences between primitive and civilized peoples were not rooted in racial and mental differences, but rather in culture, the body of tradition that the members of the tribe passed from one generation to the next. This meant that the civilized peoples of Europe were as bound by tradition as were the tribesmen of the Torres Straits. It also meant that culture was not reducible in inherited traits of biological or psychological nature. In response to the claims of the eugenics movement, Alfred Kroeber distinguished the organic and cultural realms of people and referred to culture as superorganic. In his view, culture was an emergent phenomenon that existed outside of the people who bore it. He wrote that culture is not a mental action itself. It is carried by men without being in them, but its relation to mind, its absolute rooting in the human facility is obvious. He proceeded to look at the interrelations of culture, the individual and the group. In his view, the accomplishment of the individual measured against other individuals depends, if not wholly, then mainly, on his organic composition as compounded by his heredity. The accomplishments of a group, relative to other groups, are little or not influenced by their heredity because sufficiently large groups average much alike in organic makeup. Edward Sapir, another of Boaz's students, whose interests ranged broadly from linguistics to philology to psychiatry, agreed with Kroeber that culture, the genius of people, could not be reduced to inherited traits of a biological or psychological nature. Darnell, however, felt that Kroeber's reification of culture eliminated individuals from history and obscured the relationship between culture and the psychic process. Sapir focused instead on the place of the individual in the theory of culture, the relation of the cultured individual to the cultural group. He pointed out that there was no real opposition, at last analysis, between the concept of the culture of a group and the concept of an individual culture, because they were interdependent. Sapir had a dialectical understanding of the connection between the individual and the culture of a group. In his view, individuals seek to master and transform the group's culture at the same time that they seek to reconcile their strivings on the general life of the community. They were torn between the desire to create and the desire to conform. Culture, for Sapir, was not located above people, as it was for Kroeber, but rather between individuals. Culture, in his view, provided them with traditional givens, linguistic, aesthetic, social, out of which they will construct their lives. And such as creative personalities, they bend to their own purposes, reshaping culture as the process. In Sapir's words, the self seeks instinctively for mastery, and the process of acquiring a taste of mastery that is not crude, but proportioned to the degree of sophistication proper to our time. The self is compelled to suffer an abridgment and undergo a molding. The extreme differentiation of function which the progress of man was forced upon the individual menaces of the spirit. We have no recourse but to submit with good grace to this abridgment of our activity, but it must not be allowed to clip the wings of the spirit unduly. This is the first and the most important reconciliation, the findings of a full world of spiritual satisfactions within the strait limits of an unwontedly confined economic activity. The self must set itself a point where it can, if not embrace, those spiritual life of a group, at least catch enough of its rays to burst into light and flame. Moreover, the self must learn to reconcile its own strivings, its own imperious activities, with the general spiritual life of the community. Sapir's efforts in the mid-1920s developed a theory of culture that drew inspiration from ethnology, linguistics, and personality studies, were well suited to a milieu in which both the NRC and newly formed Social Science Research Council were encouraging social scientists to break down the barriers separating their work and to do a better job at pointing out to the public the relevance of their work. As you will recall, in 1918, the president of the National Research Council urged anthropologists and psychologists to forge closer links with another and admonished anthropologists for being too narrow in their research concerns and for not convincing university administrators that their research problems were universal concerns. When Sapir took a position at the University of Chicago in 1925, he was arriving at an institution that had already supported an interdisciplinary program in the social sciences that had already been the birthplace of the Social Science Research Council, which in its early years sought to transcend the excessive over-specialization of individual research and to enhance the public image of social sciences. Sapir's broad interest and ability to develop meaningful working relationships with individuals in diverse disciplines thrived in these circumstances, and he was quickly recognized and acknowledged as a leading figure in the field, a truly public intellectual.